He changed the locks while I was recovering from surgery. I didn't find out until I was standing on my own front porch with my suitcase, and my key wouldn't turn. That was the moment everything I thought I knew about my son collapsed. Let me back up. My name is Ruth, and I'm 72 years old. I spent 31 years teaching 4th grade at Millbrook Elementary in Dayton, Ohio. I have a small house on Clover Street that my husband Gerald and I bought in 1987 for $84,000. Gerald passed 9 years ago, heart attack. Quick, no warning, and I have lived in that house alone ever since. I painted the kitchen yellow after he died because he always wanted to, and I always said no. I don't know why I thought of that detail so often in the months that followed. I think I needed to remember who I was before all of this. A woman who painted her kitchen yellow. A woman who still mattered in her own home. I have 2 children. My daughter Carol lives in Portland with her husband and their teenage twins. We talk every Sunday. She sends me photographs of the twins at their swim meets, and I print them out and put them on the refrigerator. My son Dennis lives 40 minutes away in Centerville. He sells commercial insurance. He is charming in the way that makes strangers like him immediately and makes people who know him well a little uneasy. I loved him anyway. He is my son. I loved him the way you love something that has always cost you more than you expected. In March of last year, I slipped on the back steps during an ice storm. I broke my left hip. It was a bad break, the surgeon said. I would need a full replacement and then 6 to 8 weeks of inpatient rehabilitation before I could safely return to living alone. I had never had major surgery. I had never been away from my house for more than 2 weeks in my entire adult life. The night before the operation, I lay in the hospital bed and stared at the ceiling tiles and thought about the yellow kitchen and the photographs on the refrigerator. And I promised myself I would be back there by May. Dennis came to the hospital the morning of my surgery. He sat with me before they took me back and held my hand and said, "Don't worry, Mom. I'll take care of everything." I thought he meant he would water my houseplants and collect my mail. I thanked him. I went under anesthesia feeling, for the first time since Gerald died, like I was not entirely alone. I woke up in the recovery room and the surgery had gone well. I was transferred to Meadowbrook Rehabilitation Center 6 days later. It was a clean facility, not luxurious, but clean and well-staffed. My physical therapist was a young woman named Brianna, who had the kind of relentless encouragement that should have been annoying but wasn't. I worked hard. I was determined. Every morning I told myself I was going home to my yellow kitchen. Dennis visited twice in the first 3 weeks. He brought me a poinsettia the second time, which was an odd choice for March. But I didn't say anything. He asked questions about my recovery timeline, which I appreciated. He asked whether I had looked into senior living communities, which I did not appreciate. I told him I was going home. He nodded in the way that people nod when they have already decided you are wrong. Carol called every few days. She offered to fly out. I told her to wait until I was actually home, that I didn't want her to see me struggling with a walker and feeling sorry for me. She respected that. I wish now that I had said yes. 6 weeks into my stay at Meadowbrook, Brianna told me I was ahead of schedule. I was walking the length of the hallway without stopping. I was managing stairs with a railing. I called Dennis and told him I would be ready to come home in 10 days. He said that was great news. He said he had been thinking about my house. He said there were some things we should discuss. I told him we could discuss them when I got home. I remember I was cheerful on that call. I was going home. What could there possibly be to discuss? My discharge day was a Thursday in early May. Carol had arranged for a car service to take me from Meadowbrook back to Clover Street. She had also, without telling me, paid for a home health aide named Patrice to come 3 days a week for the first month. I cried when she told me that on the phone the night before. I said it was too much. She said it wasn't enough and to stop arguing. The car pulled up to my house at 11:30 in the morning. I could see that the garden by the front walk needed attention. The tulips I had planted in October had come and gone without me. but the house looked like my house. Same white siding, same black shutters, same concrete porch where Gerald and I used to sit on summer evenings with glasses of sweet tea. I took my key out of my purse and I put it in the front door lock and I turned it. It didn't turn. I tried again. I checked that it was the right key. It was the right key. I have had the same key on the same keychain for 22 years. I know that key the way I know my own handwriting. It was the right key, and it did not open my door. I stood there on my porch in the May sunshine with my suitcase and my walker, and I felt something that I can only describe as the floor dropping out from under you when you didn't know you were standing on a floor to begin with. I called Dennis. He picked up on the second ring. I said, "I'm at the house, and my key doesn't work." There was a pause. Not a confused pause, a prepared one. I know the difference now. He said, "Mom, I've been meaning to talk to you about that." I said, "Dennis, what did you do?" He said, "I had the locks changed for your security. There have been some kids in the neighborhood. And I've also, Mom, I need you to hear me out. I've also been talking to an attorney about the house, about what makes sense going forward." I said, "What does going forward mean?" He said, "You can't live alone in that house anymore. It's not safe. You proved that in March." I said, "I slipped on ice. That is not a medical condition." He said, "Mom, just that. Just my name." In that tone. The tone that means he has already decided. And this conversation is a formality. I said, "Dennis, I want to go inside my house right now. I want you to come here and give me the key." He said he would come by later that evening. He said I should go back to Meadowbrook and he would explain everything when he saw me. I told him I was not going back to Meadowbrook. I was standing on my own front porch and I was not leaving it. He said I was being difficult. I said, "I'm being a homeowner," and I hung up. I sat down on the porch steps carefully, because of the hip, and I thought about what he had said. He had been talking to an attorney about the house, about what makes sense going forward. 2 years earlier, after a minor health scare that turned out to be nothing, Dennis had sat me down at his kitchen table and walked me through what he called basic estate planning. He said I should have a power of attorney in place, just in case. He said it was standard. He had brought the paperwork already prepared. I signed it because I trusted him, and because it seemed reasonable, and because I was tired from the drive, and he had made coffee and offered me a slice of the coffee cake his wife Sandra had baked, and the whole thing felt like a Sunday afternoon, and not like something I would later have to explain to a judge. I signed a durable power of attorney naming Dennis as my agent. I understand now what I did not understand then. A durable power of attorney does not require you to be incapacitated for the agent to act. It goes into effect immediately unless specified otherwise. It gives the agent broad authority over financial and legal decisions. It is a document built on trust, and it functions only as well as the person holding it. I sat on my porch steps, and I called Carol. She answered immediately. I said, "I need you to listen to me without panicking." She panicked anyway, quietly, the way Carol does, but she listened. I told her about the lock. I told her about the power of attorney. I told her what Dennis had said on the phone. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mom?" I told her to wait. I told her there was something I needed to check first. I knew about the Montgomery County Recorder's Office because Gerald had dealt with them twice, once when we bought the house and once when we refinanced. Property records in Ohio are public. I knew that. I had taught civics to fourth graders for 3 decades. I knew that property records were public. I called a taxi. I do not have a smartphone. I have a cellular phone that makes calls, and I went to the county recorder's office on East 3rd Street. The clerk was a woman in her 50s named Diane, who had the unhurried competence of someone who has seen everything and is surprised by nothing. I gave her my address. I gave her my name. I asked her to pull the current deed for 417 Clover Street, Dayton, Ohio. She typed for a moment. Then she looked at her screen. Then she looked at me. She said, "Ma'am, are you Ruth Calloway?" I said yes. She turned the screen toward me. The deed had been transferred. 6 weeks ago, while I was in Meadowbrook doing physical therapy with Brianna and walking the length of the hallway, my son, Dennis Allen Calloway, had used the power of attorney I signed at his kitchen table to transfer the Bree title of my house into his name. I looked at that document for a long time, long enough that Diane asked if I needed to sit down. I said no. Then I said yes. She brought me a chair from behind the counter. I have tried to explain to people what that moment felt like, and I have never quite managed it. It wasn't anger, not at first. It was something more fundamental than anger. It was the feeling of looking at a document that says your life belongs to someone else. Gerald and I had paid that mortgage for 24 years. I had painted that kitchen yellow. I had planted those tulips. I had lived in that house through his death and my grief and my recovery and my solitude and my slow, small rebuilding of a life after losing the person who made the life worth living. And my son, while I was in a rehabilitation center learning to walk again, had signed his name to it. Diane said, very quietly, that I might want to speak with an attorney. I said I knew that. I asked if there was a legal aid office nearby that helped seniors. She wrote down 2 addresses on a notepad and slid it across the counter. I went to the first address. It was the Montgomery County Legal Aid Office on Salem Avenue. I did not have an appointment. I sat in a plastic chair in the waiting room for 2 hours. A paralegal named Marcus eventually came out and took my information. He said an attorney would call me within 48 hours. I said I needed to speak to someone today. I said my son had stolen my house and I was standing outside it with my suitcase. Marcus went back through the door. He came back 10 minutes later and said Attorney Flores would see me. Fernanda Flores was around 40, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a desk covered in files. I sat across from her, and I told her everything, beginning with the ice storm in March and ending with the deed on Diane's computer screen. I put the photocopy Diane had made for me on her desk. Attorney Flores looked at it. She asked me several questions. She asked whether I had been declared mentally incompetent at any point. I said no. She asked whether I had been hospitalized for any psychiatric reason. I said no. She asked whether I had signed any additional documents transferring the house. I said not that I was aware of. She asked whether I still had a copy of the power of attorney. I said I had never been given a copy, which she wrote down with a particular expression on her face. She said this was a case of POA abuse using a valid legal instrument outside its intended scope to execute a transaction that benefited the agent at the principal's expense. She said Ohio had statutes specifically addressing this. She said it was also potentially criminal deed fraud, elder financial exploitation. She said we could file for an emergency injunction to freeze any further transactions on the property while the case was investigated. She said we should do that immediately. I asked her how long all of this would take. She said she would not lie to me. She said it could take months. I called Carol from the parking lot. She had already booked her flight. She was landing the next morning. I asked her if I could stay with her friend Beverly in Dayton. Carol had grown up with Beverly, who still lived near the old neighborhood. Carol called Beverly before I finished the sentence. Beverly said, of course, for as long as I needed. I stayed with Beverly for 11 weeks. She is a generous woman who asks very few questions and makes very good chicken soup and watches old crime dramas in the evenings, which I found, unexpectedly, comforting. Dennis called me 3 times in the first week. The calls followed a pattern. The first was defensive. He said he had done what any responsible son would do, that the house was too big for me, that he was going to sell it and put the money in a trust for my care. I asked him whose trust. He didn't answer. The second call was conciliatory, he said. We could work this out between ourselves, that we didn't need lawyers, that I was making things harder than they needed to be. I did not respond to this call at all. The third call was from Sandra, his wife, who said I was tearing the family apart. I told Sandra, with more calm than I felt, that her husband had stolen my house while I was in physical therapy and that he was welcome to feel the consequences of that. She hung up. He did not call again. Carol stayed for 2 weeks. She attended every meeting with Attorney Flores, took notes in a small green notebook, and asked questions I hadn't thought to ask. She also, on her own initiative, contacted Adult Protective Services, which opened a separate investigation into elder financial exploitation. The thing that saved me, and I mean this literally, was a neighbor named Howard Park. Howard is 78 years old and lives directly across the street from me on Clover Street. He had a security camera installed after a package theft incident 2 years ago, and it points at his driveway and, at an angle, at the front of my house. Attorney Flores, going through the timeline of the deed transfer, had established that Dennis would have needed to provide some form of notarized documentation in addition to the POA. She had requested records from the county. What she found was that the notarization had taken place at a private office, not a bank, not a title company, which was irregular. She suspected Dennis had used a notary who hadn't properly verified the scope of the POA or had been misled about the nature of the transaction. Carol, on one of her calls with me, mentioned that around the time of the transfer, Dennis had visited my house on Clover Street. She had a vague memory of him mentioning it in passing. I called Howard. I asked if his camera had picked up anything around the house in late March. He said he wasn't sure, but he still had the old footage saved to a hard drive if I wanted him to look. I said yes. Howard called me back 2 days later. His camera had recorded Dennis's car in front of my house on 3 separate occasions during my time at Meadowbrook. On one of those occasions, March 31st, a Tuesday, it had recorded a moving truck. I need you to understand what that means. While I was in rehabilitation, doing leg lifts and learning to manage stairs with a railing, my son had sent a moving truck to my house. The camera footage showed the truck backed up to the side entrance. It showed 2 men carrying items out. It showed Dennis standing in the driveway on his phone. Howard burned the footage to a disk and gave it to me in a white envelope. I brought it to Attorney Flores the next morning. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "This is excellent. The injunction went through. Dennis was prohibited from selling or further encumbering the property. A full investigation was opened by both the civil court and, after the APS referral, the county prosecutor's office. Dennis hired a lawyer. His lawyer's first position was that Dennis had acted in my best interests and within the scope of the POA. Attorney Flores's response included the video footage, the irregular notarization, the fact that I had not been declared incompetent, and the fact that the Ohio Revised Code requires an agent acting under POA to act in the principal's best interest, not the agent's. Transferring the property to his own name, with no compensation, no trust documentation, and no legal authority to do so, did not constitute acting in my best interest by any reasonable interpretation. In September, 4 months after I had stood on my porch with a key that no longer worked, I went to the Montgomery County Courthouse for the hearing. I had practiced what I would say. Beverly had listened to me say it 3 evenings in a row at her kitchen table. Carol was there. Attorney Flores was there. Howard Park drove himself to the courthouse and sat in the public gallery in a plaid shirt with his white envelope under his arm, even though the footage had already been submitted as evidence. I don't know why that made me want to cry. It just did. The judge was a woman. I'm not sure why I noticed that, but I did. Dennis sat on the other side of the courtroom. I had not seen him in 4 months. He looked thinner. He did not look at me, not once. For the entire hearing, the judge reviewed the case. She reviewed the deed transfer, the footage, the notarization irregularities, the APS findings. She reviewed the letters from Meadowbrook, confirming I had been a patient there, competent, and oriented during the entire period in question. The judge voided the deed transfer. My house was returned to my name. She also ordered Dennis to pay restitution for the moving costs. The hotel stay I had needed on my discharge day before going to Beverly's, and the fair rental value of the property during the period he had effectively denied me access to it. The total came to just over $11,000. He had 90 days to pay. On the criminal side, the elder financial exploitation charge, Dennis accepted a plea agreement. Felony charge reduced to a misdemeanor in exchange for full restitution, 5 years of probation, and mandatory completion of a financial exploitation diversion program. He would not serve jail time. I want to tell you that I was satisfied with that. I want to tell you I went home and felt that justice had been done completely and cleanly. I can't tell you that. A lot of people in my situation feel exactly what I felt, which is that a number, a fine, a probation term cannot fully account for what was taken. What was taken was not just money or property. It was the certainty that my son was my son. It was 6 weeks of my recovery spent with a shadow hanging over it that I hadn't known was there. It was the morning I stood on my own porch and couldn't get inside. But here is what I will tell you. The day I got my key, a new key, cut by a locksmith that Dennis had most certainly not hired, I drove to Clover Street alone. I didn't bring Carol. I didn't bring Beverly. I let myself inside by myself because it was my house, and I had always let myself inside by myself. Most of my furniture was there. Not all of it. Some pieces, the good ones, had been taken, and Dennis claimed to have put them in storage, which Attorney Flores is still addressing. But the couch was there. The dining table was there. The refrigerator was there, with Carol's twins' photographs still attached with magnets undisturbed. And the kitchen was yellow. I stood in the middle of my kitchen for a long time, just stood there. I didn't cry. I had expected to cry. Instead, I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for 6 months, the sensation of a door closing that was supposed to close, of a lock turning that was supposed to turn. I put the kettle on. I sat at my kitchen table in my kitchen in my house on Clover Street, and I drank the tea while it was still hot. There are things I did not understand before this that I understand now. I did not understand that a power of attorney is a document that requires your ongoing attention, not just a signature on a Tuesday afternoon. I did not understand that you can revoke a POA at any time, for any reason, and that revoking it costs nothing and requires only a notarized letter. I did not understand that Ohio, like most states, has an adult protective services unit specifically for situations like mine, and that they take these cases seriously, and that a phone call to them costs nothing. I did not understand that the county recorder's office is open to the public and that anyone can walk in and look at a deed, and that you should look at yours. I also did not understand, and this is the one that costs me the most, to say that love for a person does not protect you from what that person is capable of. I loved my son. I still love him. In the complicated and diminished way you love someone who has shown you the full shape of who they are. But love is not a security system. Love does not lock doors. Love does not prevent the wrong people from having access to the things you have spent your life building. I have a new power of attorney. It names Carol and Beverly jointly. It requires both of them to agree on any transaction above $5,000. It was drafted by Attorney Flores, and I read every page before I signed it. Dennis and I have not spoken since the courthouse. I don't know if we will. I leave that door neither open nor closed. I leave it the way Gerald used to leave, difficult questions set aside on a high shelf, to be looked at later or not at all. I am back at my Tuesday afternoon book club at the library. I am back to walking the neighborhood in the mornings, slowly, with my cane now, but walking. I have signed up to give a short presentation at the Dayton Senior Center next month on power of attorney basics, what it means, what it allows, how to protect yourself. Brianna from Meadowbrook called to check on me last week. I told her I was doing well. She said she was glad to hear it. My house is mine. My name is on the deed. My key turns in my lock. I am 72 years old, and I am still here, and I am still standing. And when someone tells you that you can't go home, you find the evidence, you find the attorney, you find the neighbor across the street with the camera, and you go home anyway. That's the only way I know how to end this. Not with a lesson exactly, and not with a warning exactly. Just with the truth of what happened and the truth of where I am now. In my kitchen. In my house. The kettle going on the stove. Come back next time if you want to. I'll still be here.